The storm was supposed to erase every sound in Ash Harbor, waves pounding against ice, shutters rattling, the wind howling like judgment. But when Noah Hale stepped off the pier with his German Shepherd, Ranger, the dog froze. His ears cut through the gale, his growl low, insistent. Noah followed his gaze, and there they were. Two little girls in torn pink dresses, huddled on a snow-caked bench, clutching a frayed teal bag as if it held their last breath. Their lips trembled, their eyes hollow,
Gonna be okay.
and one whispered the words no soldier ever forgets. Don't let them take us. In that moment, Noah knew the war he thought was over had just found him again. This time in the heart of a blizzard, with two fragile lives and one loyal dog standing between despair and deliverance. The storm was not the kind that whispered, it roared, with a voice that shook shingles loose and rattled the iron ribs of the harbor piers. Ash Harbor, a town wedged between slate-gray ocean and crooked pine ridges, was wrapped in a blanket of white fury. The lighthouse beams swept across the coast in intervals, its arc like a prayer written in light, slicing through curtains of snow. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, and streets deserted. Only the sound of the Atlantic colliding with the frozen shore broke through the howl of the blizzard. Noah Hale moved carefully along the waterfront, his boots crunching in rhythm with the gusts that clawed at his coat. He was a man of 40, his frame broad-shouldered, built by years of service as an infantryman in desert campaigns, far from this icy coastline. He carried himself with a slow precision, as though each step had been weighed and judged before touching ground. His face bore no flamboyant scars, but it carried the quiet weariness of someone who had endured too much, the kind of hollowness in the eyes that made people look away. His dark beard was dusted white by frost, his woolen cap pulled low, but nothing could soften the steel that still lived in his gaze. He had left the battlefield behind, but the battlefield had not yet left him. Beside him padded Ranger, a German shepherd, 5 years old with a coat of sable and black that gleamed even in the storm's dim light. Ranger had once been a military K-9, trained to detect danger where human senses faltered. His left ear had a fold that never quite stood upright, lending him a look of rugged nobility rather than perfection. Ranger did not bark at shadows. He conserved his voice like a soldier who understood that silence was sometimes more commanding than sound. Yet when danger stirred, his growl was primal, a sound that seemed older than civilization itself. He had been with Noah through fire and smoke, and now he was the only heartbeat Noah trusted completely. The two walked nightly through the fringes of Ash Harbor, not because Noah needed fresh air, but because ghosts refused to let him sleep. Some men numbed themselves with whiskey, others with endless noise. Noah walked with Ranger, letting the cold and the monotony of footsteps press the memories down where they could not claw at him. Tonight, however, the snow was different, deeper, louder, charged with an edge that felt almost sentient. The lamps along Harbor Street flickered in surrender, leaving gaps of darkness where only the lighthouse beam offered brief reprieve. It was in such a gap that Ranger stopped. The dog's muscles stiffened, his ears slashing against the gale, his body angled as though carved from stone. A low growl swelled from his chest, not frantic, but deliberate, like a drumbeat summoning attention. Noah felt his pulse rise. Instinct tightened his grip on nothing but the cold air. "What is it, boy?" he muttered, though he already trusted the answer. "Something." Ranger moved forward, each step surgical, leading Noah off the main path and toward the snow-buried town park that overlooked the harbor. The park was almost invisible now, the fountain at its center reduced to a lump of ice, the swings creaking weakly as if haunted by forgotten summers. The benches were swallowed by drifts, shapeless mounds of white. Noah pushed through knee-deep snow, Ranger lunging ahead. Then he saw it, a bench nearly submerged, and upon it, two small shapes fused together against the storm. They were children, two little girls, twins perhaps, no older than 7. Their hair was tangled with ice, strands plastered against flushed faces. They wore torn pink dresses that clung stiffly to their thin frames, utterly unfit for the winter's cruelty. No coats, no scarves, not even mittens. One clutched a teal canvas bag with a stitched star patch, the fabric frayed and soaked, but guarded as though it carried their souls. Their lips were cracked, their eyes glassy. One child stirred faintly, while the other simply leaned, silent as a doll left behind. Noah's breath caught. The battlefield could not have startled him more than this sight. He dropped to his knees in the snow, stripping off his coat in one swift motion. "Easy now," he whispered, his voice rough yet gentle, the tone of a man who had commanded squads but forgotten how to comfort. He wrapped the coat around both children, pulling the teal bag into the bundle as though recognizing its importance. One of the girls, Hazel, though he would not learn her name until later, opened her eyes just enough to whisper hoarsely, "Don't let them take it." Then her eyelids fluttered shut. Noah felt the weight of her words burn hotter than the wind. He scooped both girls into his arms, their combined weight featherlight, a grim reminder of hunger and cold. Their skin was icy, their breathing shallow. Ranger pressed against his leg, shielding them from the storm's lash, then surged ahead, clearing a path with powerful leaps. Together, man and dog moved like a single organism, struggling forward through drifts that clawed at their legs. Each step felt like punishment, but the fragile warmth pressed against Noah's chest gave him the strength he thought he had lost long ago. As he staggered toward the faint glow of the harbor's main street, Noah caught sight of the lighthouse beam once more, slicing through the darkness. Somewhere within that tower, the old keeper muttered to himself, watching the storm devour his town. "Night like this," he said to the walls, "if anyone still finds another, it must be a miracle." He poured his tea, unaware that the miracle had already begun in the park below. Ranger, even as he forged through the storm, sniffed sharply at intervals, nose twitching, ears angling towards scents invisible to Noah. Twice he paused, circling a patch of snow where faint trails seemed out of place. The sharp tang of gasoline, the drag of something heavy across the frost. Each time he emitted a short huff, uneasy but loyal enough to stay with his charge. Noah registered the signs dimly. His focus was on the fragile breaths against his chest. Still, the unease planted itself like a seed in the back of his mind. Something darker than the storm had touched this night. By the time Noah reached the edge of Ash Harbor's clinic lights, his lungs seared with fire, his legs burning, and his arms numb from clutching the girls. But he did not falter. The weight he carried was more than two children. It was the rediscovery of purpose. The battlefield had once given him missions carved in orders and maps. Now, amid the storm, the mission was written in the shallow heartbeat of a child and the unwavering growl of a dog. The door to the clinic swung open under his boot, warm air spilling like salvation into the night. Noah staggered inside, Ranger close behind, snow melting from their fur and clothes. Nurses shouted, rushing forward, but Noah barely heard them. He laid the girls gently on the nearest cot, his coat still wrapped around them, the teal bag clutched between their small hands. Only then did he allow himself a single exhale, long and shuddering, as if releasing years of silence. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt not the weight of war, but the weight of meaning. Ash Harbor General was a squat brick building with windows that rattled like loose teeth whenever the wind came in off the bay. Inside, the air smelled faintly of iodine and lemon polish, clean but tired, as though the walls themselves had seen too much sickness to be impressed by one more emergency. Nurses moved quickly under the harsh hum of fluorescent lights, their shoes squeaking on linoleum. Yet in the pediatric wing, room 204 glowed with a softer light. A space heater clicked in the corner, trying to wrest warmth back into two little girls who had nearly been swallowed by the storm. Hazel and Hope lay curled beneath layers of warmed blankets, their cheeks still blotched pink from the thaw, their thin arms trembling as though their bodies were learning again what safety meant. Hazel had a tiny birthmark just below her left ear, a faint splash of darker skin that set her apart from her twin. Hope's lashes were longer, brushing against her pale cheeks as she refused to meet anyone's gaze. Both clung fiercely to the teal bag, their small fingers locking around its straps as if it were a lifeline. They said nothing, not even when nurses spoke gently or when Noah tried with quiet words. The silence between them and the world felt deliberate, as though their voices had been placed under lock and key. Ranger lay stretched at the foot of the bed, his head resting between his paws, amber eyes half shut but never unfocused. The staff had tried briefly to move him out of the room, but the sound of Hazel's sob when his paws touched the hallway had ended that argument. Now the dog was a fixture, a sentinel whose calm weight steadied the air. Every so often he lifted his head, ears angling toward the window as if measuring a sound beyond human reach. The door opened and Dr. Abigail Rhodes stepped in, a woman in her mid-30s with auburn hair, pinned into a neat bun and a face marked by both kindness and exhaustion. She had grown up the daughter of fishermen in Ash Harbor, accustomed to nights spent waiting for men who sometimes never returned. That history had given her both a stubborn streak and a tenderness toward children who seemed adrift. Her white coat swayed as she checked the girl's vitals, murmuring in a soft Maine accent. She touched Hazel's wrist, counted the pulse, then glanced at Noah. "Stable now," she said, her voice carrying both relief and caution. "No frostbite, but the shock's deep." She straightened, eyes narrowing on the teal bag. "That thing's not leaving their hands, is it?" Noah shook his head. "Not even to breathe easier." Later that night, when the girls stirred faintly, Hazel tugged the bag open just enough to reveal a waterlogged notebook. She offered it to Noah without a word, her blue eyes wide and wary. Inside were drawings, childish sketches of a small house tucked into trees, a white van with two dark windows, and figures without faces. At the back, Noah found a note scrawled in shaky letters. "Don't trust the badge if the heart feels cold." His jaw tightened. He folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the notebook, returning it without question. Hazel pressed the book against her chest and shut her eyes again, her silence louder than any scream. The following morning, Dr. Peter Ames arrived. He was a tall man in his 50s, with thinning silver hair swept back and wireframe glasses that made his eyes seem perpetually thoughtful. His career as a child psychologist had been shaped decades ago, when his younger sister vanished during a family camping trip. She had been found 2 days later, unharmed but silent for nearly a year afterward. The memory had never left him, and it had carved both patience and grief into his manner. He pulled a chair beside Noah, his movements unhurried, his tone more like a confidant than a doctor. "You can't save every child," he said quietly, looking at Hazel in hope. "But sometimes saving one, just one, has a way of saving yourself." Don't forget that. Noah met his gaze, unsure whether to nod or argue, and settled for silence. That afternoon, the caseworker assigned to the situation arrived. Tessa Morales entered with a purposeful stride, her wool coat shedding snowflakes, her dark curls tucked under a knitted cap. She was 32, of Puerto Rican heritage, raised in Boston but drawn to small towns where her work felt less like bureaucracy and more like a lifeline. Her father had once vanished into addiction, and her mother had fought endlessly to keep her and her siblings fed. That fight had shaped her. She had sworn to be the hand that children could grab when the world tilted. She shook Noah's hand firmly, her brown eyes sharp but warm. "I'll start digging," she said, already pulling out a battered folder. Hours later, while the girls slept, Tessa flipped through state records at a corner desk. Her pen tapped as she found a name circled in faded ink. Rachel Arden. According to a 3-year-old intake form, Rachel had applied for temporary housing at a shelter in Bangor with 2 small children. She had never checked in. The file ended abruptly, the kind of silence that suggested someone had vanished into cracks too wide to seal. Tessa frowned, murmuring, "Rachel, what happened to you?" She underlined the name, determination sharpening her features. Back in the girls' room, the storm outside had calmed to a moaning wind that pressed against the windows like a restless ghost. Ranger stood suddenly, nose pressed to the glass, his breath fogging the pain. He sniffed once, then again, muscles stiffening. The faint odor of gasoline rode the wind, drifting in from the harbor. Noah noticed, his chest tightening. He stepped closer, hand brushing Ranger's head. "What is it?" The dog didn't bark, only gave a low huff, as if to say the night still held secrets. The room quieted again. Hazel shifted in her sleep, her hand tightening around the teal bag. Hope curled closer to her sister, their identical brows furrowing as if they dreamed the same dream. Noah sat in the corner chair, arms folded, watching them breathe, listening to Ranger's steady exhale. For years, his life had been measured by missions, coordinates, and orders. Now it was measured by the fragile sound of two little girls surviving another night. And in the silence of that hospital room, Noah began to understand what Dr. Ames had meant. Saving one or two might not change the world, but it might be enough to change his. The storm had quieted into a bitter drizzle of ice when Noah Hale returned to the waterfront the next evening. The streets of Ash Harbor glistened under street lamps. The snow pushed into ridges along the sidewalks, but the air still smelled of salt and rust. Ranger padded ahead, nose low, his breath clouding in bursts. The German shepherd moved with the deliberate rhythm of a creature born for work, his thick fur bristling as though he sensed unfinished business. Noah followed, his coat collar turned high against the wind, his mind turning over the warning in the children's notebook. Don't trust the badge if the heart feels cold. The park looked different in daylight, though no less desolate. The fountain sat frozen in silence, and the benches were still half buried in snow. Ranger tugged sharply left, leading Noah toward the docks where the fishing boats lay chained against the tide. There, beneath a sagging lamppost, half buried by drifts, stood a white sedan. Its rear window was cracked, the tires flat, and snow climbed across its roof like a shroud. Noah pulled the door with effort. It opened on hinges that squealed in protest. Inside, the car smelled of mildew and neglect. A broken child's seat lay twisted in the back. The strap snapped. The buckle cracked clean through. On the floor sat a scattered mess. Torn snack wrappers, damp papers, and a flyer for a shelter in Bangor. The name printed across the bottom made Noah's stomach tighten. Rachel Arden. He folded the paper into his coat pocket, his jaw set. The next morning, the knock at Noah's door came sharp, practiced, and entirely too confident. Ranger growled before Noah even reached the threshold, his teeth flashing white, his body braced. Noah opened the door cautiously, chain still drawn, and there stood a man wrapped in a navy parka, his hair blonde and clipped short, his smile strained into professional politeness. The badge clipped to his chest read, Child Protective Services. He introduced himself as Colton Voss, voice smooth, rehearsed, the kind of voice meant to sound official. But the seal on the badge was crooked. The laminate bubbled. His eyes, cold gray with no warmth behind them, betrayed more than his words. Colton Voss was in his late 30s, lean but broad at the shoulders, the build of someone who had once been athletic, but lived more on nerves than discipline now. His jaw was tight, his posture precise, but his gaze never lingered long enough on Noah's face. It flitted, measuring the doorframe, the windows, the street behind. Years earlier, Voss had served briefly in logistics for a private security firm before being dismissed under suspicion of misconduct, though charges had never stuck. He had learned since then that authority could be forged and trust could be weaponized. I'll need custody of the twins, Voss said lightly, as though reading a script. Better they be placed properly. Noah's hand tightened on the chain. Ranger's growl deepened, the fur along his spine rising like fire. You got papers? Noah asked flatly. Voss hesitated, then pulled a folded sheet from his parka, but the header was generic, the ink faint. Noah didn't bother to read it. His years of service had taught him the weight of real authority and the smell of counterfeit. Come back with a court order, Noah said, closing the door hard enough to rattle the hinges. Ranger barked once, a thunderclap of defiance that made Voss step back. That night, Noah sat at his desk, the lamp casting a circle of yellow light. He pulled an old military binder from the drawer, its edges frayed, its spine scarred. Inside were records he had once tried to forget. Reports of missing civilians, names whispered among soldiers, unexplained disappearances that had trailed certain contractors. Voss's name surfaced more than once, always on the periphery, never with enough evidence to tie him down. A ghost who fed on shadows. The following evening, Ranger led Noah away from the harbor and into the pine forest along the cliffs. The wind carried scents Noah could never catch, but the dog followed with grim certainty. They climbed over frozen roots and ducked beneath branches heavy with ice until the forest opened into a clearing. There, camouflaged with tarps and plywood siding, stood a cluster of trailers. A generator hummed faintly. its exhaust drifting into the air. Noah crouched low, heart pounding. The scene reeked of concealment. From inside one trailer came a muffled cry, a child's voice. Noah's jaw clenched. He moved quickly, crowbar in hand, Ranger at his side. The latch gave way under pressure, and the door swung open to a stench of stale food and sweat. Inside, on a stained mattress, a young woman sat bound at the wrists, her face bruised, her olive skin blotched with exhaustion. Two children huddled beside her, a boy no older than 3 and a girl of 5, both wide-eyed, silent with fear. "My name's Noah Hale," he whispered, cutting the zip ties with steady hands. The woman flinched but steadied herself, clutching her children. "They said transfer," she murmured, voice hoarse. "Said they'd take us somewhere safe." "Not anymore," Noah replied. Ranger sniffed the children gently, then pressed against them like a shield. Noah lifted his phone and dialed. "Sheriff Calder," he said when the line clicked. Sheriff Ruth Calder arrived within the hour, her mud-splattered SUV crunching into the clearing. Calder was in her early 60s, tall and broad, with skin weathered by years of coastal wind. Her hair, once black, was streaked white and tied back in a no-nonsense braid. She had served Ash Harbor for 3 decades, a law officer shaped by small-town stubbornness and an unshakable moral compass. She examined the trailers with a frown carved deep between her brows. "You did right calling me," she told Noah. "We'll hit this place at dawn." Meanwhile, in the hospital, Hazel stirred. She pressed her face into Ranger's fur when the dog visited later, her lips trembling. In a voice so faint it was almost wind, she whispered a single name into his ear. "Rachel." Hope squeezed her sister's hand, eyes wide, glowing with the fragile light of children who refused to let the dark win. The county courthouse in Ash Harbor stood like a stern relic of another century, its red brick facade streaked with salt stains from decades of winter storms. Inside, the air was a blend of polished oak and old paper, the kind of scent that carried both the weight of law and the fatigue of too many forgotten cases. On this morning, though, the courtroom stirred with something sharper expectation. The case of Colton Voss had drawn neighbors, reporters, and weary officers who had spent too long waiting for justice to catch up to him. Noah Hale sat near the front, his broad frame folded into a bench too narrow for his shoulders. His coat hung neatly at his side. He wore no uniform now, only a navy wool sweater, yet the posture of a soldier never left him. Ranger lay at his feet, calm and statuesque, a leather vest across his back with a simple patch. Court-approved support animal. His amber eyes scanned the room as if every whisper and shuffling step needed to be cataloged. At the prosecution's table stood Catherine Moore, the assistant district attorney, a woman in her mid-50s with sharp cheekbones and hair that had gone white early, pulled into a severe bun. She wore glasses perched low on her nose, and her voice when she spoke was precise, every syllable weighted. Moore had once been a public defender before turning to prosecution. She knew both sides of the coin, which gave her an edge in dismantling lies. A widow for nearly a decade, she carried herself with the composure of someone who had weathered storms both in court and at home. She believed deeply in the law's ability to shield the vulnerable, though she also knew it often required the courage of those very victims to tip the scale. At the center of it all sat Judge Samuel Briggs, a man in his early 60s with steel gray hair and deep creases along his forehead. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of voice that could quiet a room with 2 words. He had served 30 years in Ash Harbor's judicial system, once known for his impatience. But age had carved into him a strange balance of severity and patience. He distrusted theatrics, hated wasted time, but revered truth when it appeared plainly. When Colton Voss was let in, dressed in a plain gray suit and flanked by deputies, the room stilled. His blonde hair was combed neatly, his jaw freshly shaved, but the cold in his eyes hadn't changed. He carried himself as if the chains on his wrist were a minor inconvenience, as if he still believed authority was something he could wear like a mask. His lips curved in a smirk at the cameras before flattening into neutrality. The trial began with testimony from the young mother Noah had rescued at the trailers. She sat stiffly in the witness stand, her dark hair brushed smooth to hide the swelling at her jaw, her children cared for by volunteers down the hall. She spoke with trembling honesty, describing promises of safety that became nights locked inside, threats whispered through doors. Catherine Moore guided her gently, each question deliberate, until the narrative painted itself. Voss's lies were systematic, his false badge a tool sharpened by repetition. When Hazel and Hope were called, the room held its breath. The twins entered hand in hand, their small frames almost swallowed by the navy cardigans provided by the hospital. Their faces were pale, but their eyes, Hazel's steady, Hope's flickering, searched the room like trapped sparrows. Noah rose and walked beside them, Ranger at their side. The judge allowed the dog to accompany them, a decision shaped by letters of support from Dr. Abigail Rhodes and Tessa Morales. Hazel climbed into the witness seat first. Her feet dangled above the floor, her hands knotted in her lap. She looked down, silent, her throat tight. The prosecutor's first questions were met with a small shake of the head, her lips pressed shut. Then Ranger, sensing her fear, gave a single low bark, short and firm, as though reminding her she was not alone. Hazel's shoulders lifted. She raised one trembling finger and pointed across the courtroom at Voss. The silence cracked like glass. "That's him," she whispered. Hope followed, her testimony softer but no less damning. Together their words aligned with the evidence. The sedan at the harbor, the shelter flyer, the matching details given by other victims. Catherine Moore built her case like a wall, brick by brick, each testimony reinforcing the last. Voss's defense sputtered, his lawyer attempting to question inconsistencies, but the children's courage outshone the rhetoric. When the closing statements ended, Judge Briggs's ruling was swift. "The court finds sufficient calm," he declared, his voice echoing against the paneled walls, "to hold the defendant without bail. Charges include attempted abduction, unlawful imprisonment, child endangerment, and conspiracy." His gavel struck, and the weight of the sound felt like winter breaking. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, light and powdery, drifting sideways like pale ash. Noah stood on the courthouse steps, the cold brushing his beard, his hands steady for the first time in years. He did not speak. Silence carried his relief more clearly than words. Beside him, Ranger exhaled in a plume of steam, his eyes half-lidded but watchful. Back inside, in a quieter hallway, Hazel tugged at Noah's sleeve. She held a small red ribbon, frayed at the edges. She bent to Ranger, tying it carefully around his collar, with fingers that still shook but no longer hid. "For the hero who doesn't talk much," she said, her voice just loud enough for Noah to hear. The moment was small, fragile, yet it drew a ripple of smiles from those who saw. Even Catherine Moore, stern and unreadable for most of the day, let the corner of her mouth soften. Noah crouched beside Ranger, brushing the ribbon with one calloused finger. He didn't reply, but his silence said everything. A soldier's gratitude, a guardian's pride, and the faint stirring of hope that perhaps the war inside him was finally yielding to peace. By late March, Ash Harbor had begun to breathe again. The snow still clung in stubborn ridges along the roadsides, but the air carried a dampness that smelled of thaw, of salt water waking from its frozen grip. Along the cliffs, the pine trees dripped steadily, and the lighthouse beam, once cutting through blizzards like a plea, now swept across calmer seas with a rhythm closer to prayer, answered. On a bluff overlooking the harbor, a modest cabin had been restored plank by plank. Its cedar shingles shone with fresh stain, and smoke curled from its chimney, trailing like a banner of belonging. Inside, warmth bloomed. Hazel and Hope had claimed a corner near the stone hearth, their laughter rising as they placed picture books into crooked piles. Above the mantel, carefully mounted on brass hooks, hung the teal canvas bag. It had been cleaned and mended, no longer clutched in fear, but displayed like a flag of survival. They had named the place themselves, the Den of Hazel, Hope, and Ranger. Ranger lay stretched across a braided rug, heavier now with contentment, his coat brushed until it gleamed like polished bronze. He had taken to following the twins as though they were his compass, his amber eyes softening whenever they tugged his ears or press their faces into his side. The town had grown used to seeing him on errands with Noah, a sentinel who was also a legend. Children pointed, whispering stories of the dog who refused to let two girls vanish into the storm. It was on a gray morning, with gulls wheeling above the harbor, that Noah found the letter. Delivered in a worn brown envelope, the handwriting on the front was neat but trembled slightly, as though the writer's hand had weathered decades. Inside was a letter from Evelyn Arden. She was a woman in her late 70s, living in Portland, with silver hair kept in a bun and a body bent slightly from arthritis. A seamstress all her life, her hands bore the permanent roughness of needle and thread. The letter spoke plainly. She had seen the news of the trial, seen the bag Hazel carried. That teal fabric had once been stitched by her, the star patch sewn for her daughter Rachel. Evelyn's words bled with longing, with grief sharpened by years of silence. She asked to meet the children, not as strangers, but as blood that might still be mended. The reunion came quietly without fanfare, in the cabin by the harbor. Evelyn stepped through the door with a cane tapping softly on the wood, her eyes filling at the sight of the twins. Hazel stood still, hesitant, while Hope clutched her hand. But when Evelyn knelt as best she could and whispered, "Rachel used to sing to you before you were born," the distance closed. The embrace that followed carried years of absence, tears soaking into wool cardigans, hearts stitching themselves back together, one thread at a time. Ash Harbor responded to the story not with pity, but with resolve. The town council, guided by Sheriff Ruth Calder and the advocacy of Tessa Morales, launched a program called Warm Paws, Safe Nights. It was simple but profound: a 24-hour hotline for suspicious encounters, emergency shelters staffed by vetted volunteers, and mandatory verification procedures for anyone claiming state authority. Ranger's face, captured in a photograph with the red ribbon still tied to his collar, became the emblem of the campaign. Posters lined bus stops and church boards declaring, "Trust the warmth, not the badge alone." Noah found himself often at the edges of these gatherings, his presence requested, but his voice rarely needed. He preferred it that way. His contribution was measured in quiet patrols with Ranger, in repairs to the cabin, in the way he let the laughter of the twins echo where silence once haunted. Late at night, he wrote in a notebook at the wooden table by the window. His handwriting was steady now, not the jagged scrawl of restless nights. "It wasn't thunder that saved this harbor," he wrote. "It was a little girl's whisper, a dog who refused to turn away, and a soldier who remembered how to hope." The lighthouse continued its rotations, casting its light across sea and shore. The keeper, an old man who had tended it for decades, often chuckled to visitors that Ranger was more punctual than his own clock. "Dog knows when the tide turns," he joked. "I just follow his lead." Hazel and Hope, meanwhile, discovered their own voices, not just in whispers, but in stories. At the community center, they read aloud from picture books to other children, their words halting at times but growing stronger with each session. Ranger sat at their feet, a quiet anchor, his ears twitching at every burst of laughter. And each time the girls giggled, the frost in the room seemed to thin, as though the whole town was learning how to thaw. One evening, as dusk painted the harbor in bruised colors of lavender and slate, Noah stepped outside with Ranger. He watched the twins through the cabin window, their silhouettes framed by firelight. Evelyn seated behind them, humming a lullaby that once belonged to Rachel. He placed a hand on Ranger's collar, brushing the red ribbon that had not once been removed. The dog leaned into his side, steady as stone. For the first time since he left the battlefield, Noah felt the weight of his silence transform, not into burden but into peace. Sometimes hope doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes as the quiet step of a soldier in the snow, the steady heartbeat of a dog who refuses to look away, or the fragile courage of two little girls who held on to each other when the storm tried to take everything. Ash Harbor learned that miracles are not always grand. They can be as simple as a whisper, a ribbon, or a hand that chooses not to let go. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments, do you believe a loyal dog can be God's way of reminding us we are never alone? And if you want more stories where faith meets courage and where even the smallest act of kindness can change everything, please like this video, follow and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that remind us all that love still wins.